LSD 225 micrograms. I've had 3 trips that I can recall that have given me profound insight and the feeling of, quote, breaking through into a full ego death and immersion of my individual mind to that of the other, all on LSD. This is the story of my most recent, quote, breakthrough trip. I'll start off with some background about my set and setting. September 25th, 2018, on a Tuesday night at around 6:50 p.m. is when I dropped the tab and a half. 4 days earlier, I had dropped the other half tab on Friday night just to dip my toes back into the psychedelic waters, as I hadn't tripped in about a month and a half. So at the time, my tolerance was affected, but this trip was mind-blowing nonetheless. This is my 11th effective dose trip on LSD. I've had one 2.5 gram mushroom trip and 3 effective doses of morning glory seeds, around 6 to 8 grams of seed matter, before this particular trip. So obviously I have had my fair share, though I recognize I am nowhere near the level of other psychonauts and have yet to experience even 1% of all that psychedelia has to offer. My mindset coming into this trip was pure curiosity, paired with a general feeling of slight agitation with my life. I'm a full-time high school student at the moment, in my senior year, facing the reality of college and potentially moving out. So these trips allow me to press the reset button on my perspective about my place here on Earth. I go through periods where I feel like I can float through my life, watching myself and my thoughts from what seems like the eye behind the eyes. If you know what I mean, then great. If not, go drop some acid. And like everything, this doesn't last forever. I have equal periods of a full investment in the ego and material, which usually causes me to feel anxious. For 4 of my trips prior, I felt like I had gained little to nothing until this one. So it goes without saying that I was feeling a bit stuck for a few months leading up to this trip. So enough about me. Here's the experience. After I dropped, I laid in my bed and listened to music, which I often do during the acid come up, as music is absolutely amazing and deep on it. About an hour and a half or so in, I was greeted with the familiar feeling of hypersenses. I remember the first effects being increased visual acuity, brighter colors, clear peripheral vision, sharper edges, etc. Increased ability to hear and to feel, sounds of the house creaking, pops and cracks of my body, flowing of my blood and function of my organs being exaggerated in my ears, the feeling of pinpricks on the whole surface of my skin and in my teeth, etc. I've also come to learn through hours of experimenting with myself on LSD that my sense of proprioception was immensely clear. This sense is the awareness of one's own body position relative to other parts of itself and is quite well documented, though not commonly listed as one of the 5 senses. And as I was coming up, I could close my eyes and move my hand in front of my face and see it clearly. It almost looked blue and transparent. This was intensely interesting and amusing. At this point, I'm about 2 to 3 hours post-drop. While coming up, the trip began to get more and more confusing, as it usually does around this time frame. So I rode out the come up with music and closed my eyes in my bed. I can't recall that much from the beginning of my trip, as it began to hit me a bit by surprise, and was quite difficult to make any sense of. I was a bit anxious and uncomfortable at this point, but knew I had to surrender and just enjoy the show as the chemical invaded my serotonin receptors. I remember a few things from this period of my trip. In my experience, this is when the trivial aspects of psychedelics are the most pronounced. Bizarre closed-eye visuals such as spirals and geometric patterns that change constantly, waves of bright colors and sharp lines and shapes that you don't usually see here on Earth, though some very close to home, such as Fibonacci spirals and what I can only explain as what looked like ancient artworks. Open-eyed visuals are a lot less intense for me, breathing of the walls and curtains, colors changing on every surface similarly to the way a cuttlefish flashes between his array of camouflage. I remember one open-eye visual that surprised me a bit, and that was this: looking at my desk and watching as it split into many versions of itself, which all drifted apart from each other, then they all snapped quickly back into the original desk. This would happen at a perfect rhythm. Drift, snap. Drift, snap. For at least a few minutes. I've had this visual once before, and it was also a precursor to the dissolution of ego I was about to experience. At this point, around 4 to 5 hours in, I decide to get up to pee and look at myself in the mirror. As my feet hit the floor, I looked down and saw myself as an animal. My legs looked like bizarre organic tools and were nearly unrecognizable to me. I remember at this moment being thrown into a recent memory of studying a praying mantis and being in awe of its biology. Except this time I saw myself as the praying mantis, a completely weird product of biology. I walked to the bathroom, peed, and stared at myself in the mirror. I became frozen. This is the beginning of the peak, so the feeling of understanding was building in my core, and I could feel my ego dissolve just a little bit every time my mind hastily answered every question I posed to it. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I studied my own form and complex biology in my muscles. I remembered a quote about sand dunes being the product of invisible wind, the dunes acting as a blurred reflection of what can't be usually seen. At this point, I looked at myself as a similar manifestation. I saw that my infinitely complex and beautiful body is merely a sand dune shaped by the winds of a pure and ancient intelligence. This was a deep insight and encouraged me to meditate, to go as deep as I was willing to bear. I don't remember how I ended up on my floor, but my next memory is me sitting upright, legs crossed, and hands on my knees in total relaxation. I kind of just found my way into this position without any plans to mimic the meditating Buddha. I practice meditation as often as possible, mostly because it provides me with a clear view on life when things get hectic, so I can go pretty deep even without psychedelics. I let myself drift deeper and deeper into my mind. I watched my thoughts, and I watched the patterns and lights, until I felt as if I was literally walking around in my own head. And as soon as I realized this, I was amazed. I remember looking around in my mind and seeing everything that made me. But I wasn't my human self. I was observing my human self. It was like walking down a path surrounded with all my memories and experience. In this space were also things that I don't recognize as part of myself, but I felt at peace all the same. Intense colors and impossible geometry surrounded me with vibrance while I flew through my brain. I remember specifically visually seeing everyone I've ever fallen in love with, in some type of blue pod, like a screen showing me loops of my memories with them, and recalled every single time I've had sex with any of them, very vividly. These types of thoughts usually upset me at least a little bit, but I clearly remember saying to myself these words, "Well, that was interesting. Let's keep going. What else is here?" Completely unfazed by vivid memories of people who I've felt lonely without. It was amazing. I felt invincible in my own thoughts. Things that usually cause me the most stress seemed so small and unimportant. It had the feeling of being in a wonderland, completely magical. The notion I had was of myself, whistling, marching down a sunlit path, chin up, spring in my step, and my eyes closed in complete trust. Obviously, this way of describing the experience does it absolutely no justice, but let's just say that was the theme of the trip at this point. Now we reached what I would say was the climax of the peak, and this is where things take a bit of a turn. We are now at around 6 hours after I dropped. The meditation was beautiful, and walking through the museum of all my thoughts was fascinating, so I found myself lying flat on my floor. I went deeper and deeper into my head, zooming past all my aspects, and on every ego death trip, I felt my body literally melt into wherever I am, and this feeling of dissolving began, and I thought I was ready. Then very suddenly I felt a darkness seep into my headspace. This darkness was intrusive, and I remember the feeling of something peeking in on me, then hiding again only to peek in on me from a different place. All this time my eyes were closed, and I felt absolutely positive that there was a figure standing in the corner of my room. Now at this point, I would have usually snapped my eyes open to see nothing and stop meditating, but my mentality was different this time. I felt like I met the reason I was feeling stuck in my life, and I knew I must overcome this by inviting it and accepting it completely. So I kept my eyes closed and invited the darkness. I felt like my chest opened up physically, and I remembered trying as hard as I could to remain vulnerable. Kept my eyes closed, opened up my being, allowed any thoughts ample space to grow in my head. It was horrifying. I felt the darkness fall into my body, and I suddenly realized that there is no darkness at all. This was just a personification of my own fear. I remember smiling as I realized that this was simply something I've made up. My fear had been slowly growing in the depths of my mind for weeks without me noticing. It became something of its own entity in my head, and has been keeping me stuck, afraid to do anything that I could fail at. That's why it appeared to me the way it did. Only after peeling back many, many layers of myself was I met with this fear, and I knew I had to invite it back into myself to realize that it has no power over me, and is just another part of what makes me. I felt that this darkness was something I had to conquer in life and in the trip. This was the final layer, the final exhibit in the museum of my mind. What happened next is simply not allowed into words. I was no longer drifting through the circus of my thoughts and memories. I was there, surrounded by blissful chaos with no recollection of my body or what a human looks like. Everything was there. Everything was. Everything. I was everything. I met it, and it granted me forbidden knowledge. It told me the secrets of life, and clearly displayed everything in a way that made complete and undeniable sense. I was no longer myself. I simply was, and I knew everything that there ever will be or ever was known. This lasted maybe an hour, and obviously as I came out of my meditation, I slowly forgot most of the answers and wisdom and unearned forbidden secrets of the universe, which is alright with me, because that seems like it might be a slight burden to any ape who knows what's actually going on. I laid back down in my bed, completely wired but coming down. I watch Fortnite videos on YouTube just because I can, and had some periods of complete confusion while drifting off to sleep. For instance, as I was falling asleep, I would lose track of myself and suddenly be in our laundry room awake. This caught me completely by surprise, and suddenly I opened my eyes, and I had been in my bed the whole time, kind of like a very vivid lucid dream. This was bizarre, but nothing compared to the utter profoundness during whatever happened after I conquered my fear character. So eventually I fell asleep around 3 to 4 a.m. Woke up the next morning with a beautiful afterglow and went to school with red eyes and a smirk on my face all day. What I've learned from this is that I can't worry. I shouldn't. Neither should you. And don't forget who you are.